Greetings, everyone. This is Abhivadan from the Bharat Pacific. Today, we have a very interesting discussion on the go. So, we have a very special guest. We have Mr. Rupak Chattopadhyay from Canada. So, let me introduce the guest and let me introduce the context of this discussion that we are having. So, last time we have had a discussion with Akshob from ORF, and we had discussed about the Iran-Saudi rapprochement on, how did Beijing do it, and what was the achievement of China in that, and what does it mean for the geopolitics of infrastructure and obviously the economic effort of countries like China and India. Now, what happens is that whenever we talk about concepts like the Indo-Pacific, or we talk about the transatlantic, or we talk about how Beijing has become very important, or how Russia and China are doing together in terms of what's happening in other things, we often see this thing that infrastructure becomes a key point of discussion among geopolitical players and businesses around the world. And while there are projects like, even Gati Shakti has its own value in India, there is a global gateway network, there is obviously Build Back Better, and there is definitely the most infamous and obviously, you know, polarized now in discussions, in media discussions, what we call as the OBO, or One Belt, One Road initiative by China. And we definitely have discussed geopolitics in certain contexts like regions and regulations and technology, but the economics of infrastructure is very important for the global economy because it shapes the way our factors of human mobility work in emerging markets. And that's why I thought that we should have this podcast discussion with Rupak ji. And so let me introduce the guest quickly, and then we will begin with the discussion. Rupak ji is the president and CEO of the Forum of Federations since 2011. Uh, he's a person who I find very interesting in a sense that his understanding of federalism and political constitutional reforms in countries in the global south, especially in India, in African countries, that has been quite interesting. Even the way he, elaborates upon how Western democracies focus on infrastructure and political reforms in that particular sense, that actually interested me. That's why I wish to have this discussion. So, Rupak ji, so sorry for this long introduction, but yeah, welcome to the podcast.
Abhi, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and to interact also as we often do on other platforms. So delighted to be here. Let me add a disclaimer that I'm speaking here in my personal capacity, free from any affiliations. So I look forward to to our discussion going forward.
Definitely. So let's begin with the state of the global economy to keep some understanding ahead, because there could be many among our viewers who might not be aware of what's happening here. So, uh, after COVID struck the world, the way we looked at infrastructure and its whole economics obviously was becoming important. It obviously was halted in many parts of the world. Certain countries had their own advantages, while certain countries were not able to do much. Obviously, there were relevant issues due to HR, wherein obviously human resources, that is, people, were affected by the pandemic and so forth. Supply chains were, I would say, affected. So, when we look at 2023, amidst uh, the situation that we are in, which is mixed bag, because obviously we have supply chain issues due to the Ukraine war. Then we have again pricing issues due to the fuel pricing, which is in the GCC countries, and many other issues which are in line with. What do you think about the way countries look at infrastructure as a part of their political economy?
Infrastructure historically has been a major driver of economic growth and employment generation. We only have to look back to the 1930s and everything that was done under the New Deal to see the impact that infrastructure has had in economic growth, not only because it provides immediate employment for people who are working on the infrastructure process, but because of the multiplier it provides in terms of demand for good intermediate goods that are employed. And certainly in much of the global south, infrastructure is sorely lacking. And by infrastructure, I say this very broadly, not just in the context of what we think of as classically as infrastructure, like roads and bridges, but also more and more, digital infrastructure. Because one of the things that one has to remember, or COVID brought into focus very sharply, was the importance of what I would call digital governance. both in the terms both in terms of the governments being able to remain connected to people in the absence of physical uh, interactions, but also through that ensuring service delivery. One of the sort of main functions of government is service delivery to its citizens, and if there is a disruption in that, government is clearly failing in its duties to its citizens. So in that context, I think infrastructure is very important. I mean, those who live in the global south know how much people have suffered from paucity of physical infrastructures. You know, not having access to roads and bridges means that we've all heard stories of people walking miles to go to school, swimming across rivers, so on and so forth. And it really has, I mean, an impact. Uh, and sort of building up infrastructure will really have the multiplier effect also on what I would call human capital. Connecting people to where they need to go has an impact on the quality of life. So I think infrastructure is very, very important. Now, the issue, of course, is given given the expenditures around COVID, given the war in Ukraine, and how much that is impacted on the global economy, uh, how is how is capital going to be mobilized to meet this demand for infrastructure? And that is, I think, a question that's still a bit open.
Following it up on that, I would like to go to the kind of political economy of infrastructure, mostly like the kind of factors working behind them. Now we have three models of world standard infra development. One is China, where if the state decides, then within few months, then this things start rolling. Then other is EU and US, where for instance, EU and US has certain plan. Now, if private sector chips in, then things move forward. Otherwise, if they don't find attractive, whatever the state wants to do, they don't necessarily move forward. Like we have seen in the case of Global Gateway uh, like, network, like the EU has launched, that is going nowhere yet, even though they have grand plans. Now there is a third model, Japan. Now we think, now the two examples that I have given, people put it as okay, it's a communist state and one is the liberal democracy, so there are constraints. But Japan, being a liberal democracy, still its infra plans move like China does. There is kind of so what is the what are the things, do you think like necessarily India, which is going to be like a middle income economy in a decade, if I mean we are a lower middle income economy now, but like we will be a decently, in purchasing power terms we are still $9,000, but we will be decent enough economy in a decade. uh, do you think we can follow Japanese model, or do you even have the political institutions, bureaucratic institutions, or political economy that make us follow Japanese model, or we will go again the messy Western style model where we plan two steps ahead but we move only half a step?
I mean, it's always difficult to foresee the future, but certainly one of the big deficits in India is state capacity, right? And state capacity, politicking. These are the big obstacles to moving forward in a consistent manner. I mean, just look. I mean, the story of the high-speed train between Ahmedabad and Bombay. Now, for any government really should, regardless of party affiliation, should support projects like that. Yet, even on those sorts of things, they have, they find ways in which to sabotage what should be what something that would improve the lives of their own constituents. Similarly, you see again with the development of metro rail, it has really varied on different states, the speeds at which these things have moved. So I you know I don't think the corporatist model that the Japanese have would work in India, because simply just because our reality is so different and our politics is not going to change anytime soon. So we will continue to be somewhere in the middle where the state it'll continue to be state-led development for sure. I don't doubt that. But it'll have to navigate I think the ups and downs of politics. I mean, look at the cry, the big cry around uh, conglomerates who are close to the state. Now, if we look at the case of Japan or South Korea, both development, the industrialization in these countries were led essentially state-led in partnership with select business houses. And really, in the early years of Indian development, that's how it was in India too. But this has now become a political issue that should not be, in my view. Yes, I understand the whole issue around trans good corporate governance and corporate transparency and all of that. But that is a failing of our regulatory mechanisms, not of the model per se. Because one of the advantages that China enjoys about everybody else is that the Chinese model is solidly rooted in state-led through select corporations industrialization. Without that kind of intervention, you simply cannot have the scale that is needed in order to in order to industrialize on a large scale. So no, I think the realities of Indian politics will temper, and I would just call it the Indian model, which is very different from the Chinese or the Western or the Japanese model.
So the difference between Japan or China, is it necessarily about communist state and democracy in this case, or is it like the things that go decades old cultural things that makes, even though both are completely different political institutions, the efficiency in infrastructure making is quite similar. Like once they've set the plans, they even when Japan invests outside the country, Japan is the only country that could match China's BRI even anywhere close basically. Japan faces troubles only when there are political troubles, like we have seen in the case of Maharashtra, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
Otherwise, if you give Japanese people free room, they actually implement it the way they plan. So,
Yeah,
but is it necessarily communist state versus democratic state, or is there something extra that works in their favor?
Yeah, I don't think communism or capitalism has to do with it. I just think it has to do with state capacity. I think it has to do with the mindset. Perhaps some people use the term political culture. Perhaps that has a lot to do with it. I mean, certainly the Korean model is very much the Japanese model, and it's also a function of the fact that Korea for a long time was a Japanese colony. So the Korean administration is steeped in the same mindset that you see in Japan. In terms of China, yeah, I really think perhaps it has to do with yeah. So to me, yeah, I don't think it's capitalism, communism. I think it just is to use that reductionist term, political culture, that allows them to move the way they do.
Let me just then add some context to it, maybe since we are discussing about India, and we'll come on India. I think it's very hilarious trend in certain cities, certain districts in India, and I'm like talking about random cities. I'm not saying just some cities in Maharashtra and not in certain cities in other states. It could be in other cities as well. I mean, I can start from Indore to whatsoever, right? And we see that in certain districts, there are certain local authorities who actually push towards certain development work, and at a basic level, political consensus doesn't affect anything, and issues don't come in. But when we really take it to the upfront, sometimes the political economy is very immature to take these issues forward. So I'll come on that part maybe later. Let's understand a bit about the cooperation part among countries on this at a global scale. Now, since 2014, the benefit that India had in justifying its own geopolitics and its own foreign policy avenues was that we are a country which fosters on infrastructure pretty well. We are a country which builds a lot of highways, and we complete the not complete. I would say we extend the Golden Quadrilateral. We empower the nation by our railways. We have metro networks and so forth. India is such a big place with a big population, so that's a great model. Even in this G20 presidency, I think we are trying to portray that aspect. Then obviously elections and other things, we use VVPAT machines instead of ballots and all those things. And like you said, China has its own model, Japan has its own model. I mean, recently what happened was that a whole deal between Airbus and China, the Chinese government, if I'm right, happened for a new assembly of planes to be manufactured there, if I'm right, for a new line of planes, if I'm right. So when we look at the geopolitical side of it, the diplomatic side of it, um, my view is that maybe the US and European nations could need India in certain aspects when it comes to doing anything in the global south, and maybe even in India or Southeast Asia wherever necessary. If Southeast Asia doesn't do, and I'm not talking about Japan and Korea, I'm talking about the rest of the ASEAN members. So, from a cooperation perspective, how do you think it's really working up for countries? Because at a global scale, it was sadly a very weird assessment in economics that, oh, manufacturing jobs won't be needed because this hype of technology and whatnot. While digital governance is becoming relevant, like you rightly pointed out, DPI is the thing, and India is kind of a leader in DPI, not just because of fintech, but also because of other things. Um, what do you think about the aspect of cooperation which is building up these days? Do you think that there is a trajectory that the global economy is going through? What do you think? Yeah.
Oh, global economy and cooperation. I think we are moving from a period of offshoring to a period of friendshoring. I don't know if you've heard that term. Uh, 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 Again, it's I I think we are past globalization. I think we will see more opportunistic cooperation between countries that have what I would call a convergence of interests. I mean, Bismarck said, there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. And I think a lot of this will be driven by that. I mean, beyond that, I don't know what more to say. I mean, I'll give you an example. Some years ago, actually even recently in Canada, we couldn't find children's Tylenol and children's Advil. These are very basic painkillers, right? One is an ibuprofen, the other is an acetaminophen, and we for 6 months these were not available. And then we discovered that despite these being very different medications, the active ingredient for them was made by a single factory in China. And so this gives a sense of uh, the uh, the dangers on relying on such tenuous supply chains. And so I think manufacturing going forward will have, I mean, if for the future to have resiliency, will have to take these sorts of things into account. And already, some years before, I forget what drug it was, but there was a drug whose uh, first the generic drug was pulled off the market because the API was shown to be carcinogenic. Then the European brand was pulled off. Then the American brand was pulled off. And after investigation, it was found that the APIs for all three, regardless of whether you bought the generic or the European or the American branded products, it was the same factory in China that was producing the API. One factory, not even multiple factories, in order to gain efficiencies of scale and so on and so forth. So this clearly after COVID is no longer tenable or desirable, and especially with the long shutdowns that the factory of the world had in pursuit of zero COVID, people were not able to obtain what goods which should have been easily obtainable, and things that people take for granted. So I think this will drive a lot this friend shoring. Decoupling, I think, is too strong, and I think it's very hard to decouple in the world that we live in. But certainly it will be very different going forward.
So I think decoupling is hard, as you say, but recent EU Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen has said that EU President UCF has said that she used the word de-risking instead of decouple. So whatever that means, de-risking. But yeah, people
So
want to just use new
de-risking is, I
words.
think, I mean, again, I don't think it's defined, but to be de-risking is, friend shoring.
Yeah. Friendship, of course. Like there is, I think it was in 2013. I think it's Greg Ip, the economist, one of the economic writer in The Economist who used the word gated globalization. And since then, and I think friendshoring is kind of synonymous with the same term, gated globalization, basically, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, as you correctly said, uh, over the last 50 years, or since the late 70s, early 80s, companies have only looked at the bottom line, and of course they should. I mean, that's the way capitalism works, right? You drive down costs, but the other leg of that is diversifying risk. So there has been too much emphasis on lowering cost, not enough on diversifying risk. So hopefully, this will be something for the future. But it also means that we will have to tolerate in pursuit of so there's always a premium, right, with risk diversification. So globally, people should be prepared to pay that that cost of paying more for a good than we did in the past, because you now, instead of doing everything in one location, you now have to spread the production.
So speaking of de-risking, you have earlier mentioned that there is a question of capital, basically, and this mostly comes to the way the respective economic systems work. So in the US and the EU especially, state doesn't have enough money, or state can't mobilize on its own enough money like the private sector does. But they do have grand plans. Now, grand plans in the sense of a global gateway network, or earlier Trump coined the term blue dot network. God knows what happened to that. But I think if I'm not wrong, it's Green New Deal, or
Yeah, yeah,
New Deal. It's New
yeah.
Deal. But like, but what is actually happening on that front? Like, where is the capital is coming from? And I don't think private sector in either EU or US is I mean, they may invest in their own economies to sell their respective constituents some of the incentives, but I don't think they would follow the state narrative in terms of investing outside their respective economies.
Yeah, no, I don't think so either. I mean, I don't think so either. And certainly, if private capital invests abroad, it's to get a return, right? And if it's not uh, profitable or not economically viable, they wouldn't do it. I mean, Hambantota is case in point, right? There was a long-standing demand from some people to build a port in Hambantota, and the Chinese were only the last people they asked. They went to others, and everybody said, "No, you can't build a port here, and here is the reason why. It's at the mouth of a river, so you'll have continuous silting, so on and so forth. It just topographically, it wasn't possible or viable to do it, and so nobody, no private capital built a port in Hambantota, and already there was a huge port in Colombo, which was close enough and could actually be augmented for what was needed. So you ended up, BRI projects ended up building these things, not so much because of the economic sense they made, but because of the political payoffs potentially from those kinds of investments.
Yeah. I remember our discussion, and since we're talking about BRI now, and maybe after that we can go to India. We had a discussion with Abhishek Mishra from ORF. He, specializes in Africa studies, and uh, this is about Africa, which I'm going to ask. So we saw this thing where he said that, okay, fine, BRI definitely is related to debt trap issues and political turmoils, and how Chinese corporations work with countries like Sri Lanka, and maybe even how the Chinese are trying to do in the Caucasus and Eastern Europe. Now, obviously, due to the Ukraine situation, obviously it's messed up, so they have to again look through how would they go. But when we look at Africa, his claim is that there are certain aspects of development projects which are really working out, not in a complete sense, but in certain sense for government. However, then again, it reminds us of India's contributions also, certain palaces, certain buildings, and certain support. So when we look at Africa, the concern which India has raised, and even certain scholars and certain professionals in India raise, is that now since America's heft to influence the economics of infrastructure in Africa has gone down, because obviously they were exploitative before. Now they're not that much expansive anymore. They just don't have the capability to do so, and it just can't be through the means of conflict economics, which is to start waging wars or not start waging wars, just involved in some conflict. It can't go that way. So America's capacity to have development economics in Africa definitely has gone down. While India is not even doing that much right now, because again, India will take time. New Delhi is still trying, MEA is still trying. But when we look at the need to have strategic investments, what do you think about what's China and even Turkey? Because China and Turkey are playing very interestingly in Africa. Do you really think it's not debt trap, or do you really think what can India learn from them, their mistakes and the best what they're doing?
Look, I think I think the Chinese earn a lot of. Um, I think certainly there is some goodwill for the Chinese because they built a kind of infrastructure nobody else had built before in countries which couldn't afford to do it, and to that extent, I think this was a very clever move on their part. Now, the expectation that somehow that these countries would pay for these infrastructure that don't have the means to do it, I think was unreasonable on the part of the Chinese. So now the Chinese are beginning to take a haircut on that because these countries, I mean, the reason nobody built this infrastructure before there was because they didn't have the means to do it. You know, countries where they had the means to do it, they did it. You won't believe this, but in the late 70s, Nigeria had the quality of highways and roads that one only saw in India in the last 20 years. Because they were an oil producing country. I mean the international airport that came into operation in Lagos in 1979 or 1979. That quality of airport India saw only 20 years later. But this was a fact. They could do it. But there were other countries in Africa who simply didn't have the means. Now, through BRI, they were able to obtain infrastructure that is world class and modern. I'm sure there are problems, and so they took what was on offer and exchanged it for whatever the Chinese wanted. So there was a mutual coincidence of needs and wants, and they did that. Uh, Now, whenever infrastructure is built or anything is built anywhere, somebody has to pay for it, right? There's no free lunch. It is either you're either giving up sovereignty or your mineral wealth or cash. And in the case of in the case of the of the non-Chinese Indians in the West, you have to determine to what extent it is in your national interest to spend your treasure to build infrastructure or anything else in any part of the world. And the Chinese at some point made the calculation that this was very important to them. And and more importantly, they had the means to spend the money, which India clearly, that doesn't have. And maybe when India has the means to do it, they'll do it. But like, we return then again to this idea of mindset uh, uh, where in India, your your ability to do or build anything is based on whether the deputy secretary feels that he can move the file, he or she can move the file, right? That is not how Chinese decision making is. And similarly in the West, there are so many other considerations, administrative and otherwise, that they too may not be very unlikely to match the scale and the speed with which the Chinese have done it.
So before coming into the only India specific segment or like questions regarding India, are we to assume that now that India is at least a decade away from actually having any sizable economic size to make sizable outward investment in Africa or Latin America? I personally think India would need to be at least $6-7 trillion economy to have any sizable impact. So maybe if not decade, 6-7 years away. Given that context, in the short term to medium term, in next 5 to 7 years perspective, are we to assume between no capital and unsustainable? uh, on the one hand, we have no capital in the West. On the other hand, we have unsustainable debt trap based, economically unfriendly investment from Chinese. So Chinese will get to say whatever they want. I mean, by the looks of it, even if West wants to provide the alternative, they can't actually do anything, even
They
if they
don't
want.
have, in my view, they don't have the capacity to do it. Uh, and, but Aditya, you're making a very important point. So between no capital and sort of no investment and doing these grand projects, there are things in the middle which the West and India are doing. Things like providing livelihoods. I think in Tanzania the Indians were doing irrigation works. Those sorts of things I think
Yeah,
are
yeah.
are of great value and will and continue to be of importance, the role that the West and countries like India can play in Africa. uh, I mean, the important thing, of course, is to make sure. I mean, to ascribe agency to the Africans, they have needs that they articulate, and for the Indians in the West to play any role, or to play a significant and well appreciated role, means to respond to these needs, and some of these needs are very very basic. Whether it's building, irrigation or schools or things like that. So that there is a role. There is a role even before you become a $6 trillion or $7 trillion economy and build, ports and highways and things like that. And the Indians have done it in the past. They've done railways and stuff like that. So it's there. It's there. It's just it won't be on the grand scale that the Chinese have done it in the past.
So coming to the India part, where do you see India playing a role? As you have already briefly touched upon that question, but the way I see it at the moment, India is actually playing kind of a low-hanging enabling role wherever it can, where there is low risk, high investment kind of projects in Africa and across South Asia, basically. South Asia, I mean in the geographical sense, not the North American identical sense. So I just want to be clear there. But uh, and I do see Japan, for example, partnering India along. India necessarily doesn't always provide the capital that Japanese would like to have, but it always wants to tag India along. And we have seen that Japan is actually supporting India
Huh.
of their vision by, and they want to make India the key partner and the bridge between global South and global North. Do you think that will be the India's role for the next decade, or how do you see it?
It's not a bad role to have, frankly, and it's. I think what the Indians have proven in the past, particularly in the region, in countries like Sri Lanka and Nepal, is the Indians are the reliable partner, right? When the chips are down, the Indians will be there for you. After the earthquake in Nepal, the first and the largest rescue effort came from India. Ditto in Sri Lanka. The Chinese who had built all these grandiose projects. If I'm happy to be corrected on this, but in the midst of the crisis, the Chinese probably provided 30-40 million dollars in aid, whereas the Indians, along with the Japanese, were the ones who were keeping the lights on and people fed and so on and so forth, providing critical things at on very very generous terms. So similarly. India has done this in other parts of the world before. So this Indians are the ones you rely on when the chips are down, and I think this is not a bad role to have because people remember this. I was in Colombo in September, and people talked about the role India had in supplying fuel and medicines and critical food stuff to Sri Lanka, the common people, and I think that's very important. It's an important role to play. It should not be discounted. The biggest role that India played that people talk about during COVID was supplying vaccines. Nobody, everybody else, all the great and the good in the world were hoarding vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, in fact, if we remember, I think we all may remember, there was a Quad initiative on vaccines. And it was decided by the Biden administration and obviously the rest of the counterparts in the Quad that, oh, Australia, India, and all of those will do together. But America will only offer some, I don't know, 8 million vaccines, or very less than to the South Asian region. And then what happened was that I think it was that, okay, India and Australia will work on the capacity building on for, giving vaccines to the global South. But obviously, India was the leader in that. India did the most in that. And I mean, countries like Brazil and others thanked India for the efforts. So I think it was under the, I don't remember the word. It was, um, Okay, it was some emission, okay, but I can't remember right now. It was very much praised during the Delta wave, after the Delta wave, obviously, when it started. So, yeah. I'm so sorry, I just cut you off between. So, if yeah, I think that
No,
you
no,
were
no.
there.
I agree with you. What you said, it's very important to play that role. The importance is consistency, and because I'm not. I don't think for a long time the Indians will be able to do what the Chinese do in terms of quick decision making and strategic decision making. I mean, one of the reasons. The Indians, for example, for years have wanted to sell weapons, but can't is because they're incapable of bribing people, right? I mean, the public sector is incapable of doing that, whereas the Chinese can. I'm actually reading a fascinating book called The Looting Machine, which is about resource policy in Africa, and the chapter on Angola is really very instructive in terms of how there was an oil uh, uh, an oil block that ONGC had bid for, and other companies as well. And eventually it ended up going to the Chinese because the Chinese were able to structure deals in a way that would benefit the people making the decisions on that end, which for the public sector in India or in the West is very difficult to do. So that again, this returns to the issue that's like structural mindset. You just can't compete. I mean, as democracies, even if you are, even if you are flawed, there are certain rules and regulations, certain elements of transparency that come into play, which don't, those rules don't apply to places like China, and so they can do things that others can't.
So I would like to come to the last two points of the Indian question. One is corporate India's role, and other is the Indian federal political economy. So first, if we come to corporate India's role, like we have talked about how Western corporates are not ready to risk their capital. But do you think Indian corporates, if tomorrow, if India needs it, they would be willing to risk their capital, like GMRs of the world, L&Ts, Tata Infrastructure, or Adani's in energy sector, maybe Reliance and ONGCs. I mean, of course, PSUs will, of
No,
course,
but we've seen them. We've seen them do that, right? Certainly in the Indian context. When the Ambanis built Jamnagar, India was not one of the largest exporters of refined petroleum products. Today, India is one of the world's largest. So they've taken those gambles, they've taken those risks. My reading from the outside of why the number of India plays so well with the Adanis is because they are a vehicle for strategic investments. They are willing to go out and take risks that others either don't want to or don't have the capacity to do. And this is why the Adanis have benefited the way they have over the last few years. It's as simple as that. And all over the world, governments have champions. I mean, this is how the Chinese do it. This is how the Japanese have done it. You have national champions who you deploy with state backing.
The reason why I asked that question is if we look at like the kind of a corporate practices India is developing, most would look towards the West whenever they talks about standards of corporate governance. However, in terms of strategic investments, the corporate sector generally, it's the East that has mostly been worked towards corporate when it comes to the strategic investments, even if there are risks. So would you think like Indian corporate sector withstand the criticism of Indian corporate practitioners who look towards the West more than the East, basically? That's where the
Look,
dichotomy comes.
Aditya, there is no one Western model because the French have always had a very different model. The Gaullist idea of dirigiste, state directed, has played a very important role in the way the French dealt with the deployed private capital as uh, uh, as agents of state interest. So there are multiple Western models. The question is which one you want to look at, and they're not the only ones. The others have done it, right? I mean, what is good? What was the saying? What is good for GM is good for America. It's that same. It's the same, and all governments,
But that
even in the
was
West.
long time ago. Like I'm talking about in the modern sense, like in the last 3 to 4 decades, like
With
the
3 to 4 decades, but even there, the Western governments go out and campaign and canvass and lobby for their own companies, right? I mean, Boeing versus Airbus. Uh, every time an American delegation comes to America to India, they're trying to sell Boeing, Boeing wares or Westinghouse reactors. This is the way it is, and so it's. The expectation that somehow that Indian capitalists should adopt the Western model is based on that very flawed thinking that the moment you give birth to a child, they should be 6 foot tall and have a six pack. Muscle doesn't work like that. Everything is context specific. Western capital didn't get to its transparent, uh, responsible self from day one. The process of capitalism in the US has been a very brutal one, and it has evolved in response to society, in response to regulation, so on and so forth. And the Indians have to get there, but it has to be something that they evolve towards, not, not something that's going to come overnight.
Yeah. I think from a regulatory standpoint, if we look at the volatility in America, for example, India and US are very much related when it comes to technology markets in certain sectors because obviously service economy dependency. But I think one which I really like when it comes to India's corporate governance is how our regulators from RBI to SEBI and others handle the markets and handle certain aspects of compliance and regulation. There are problems with our system for sure, maybe at a nodal level in certain departments, in certain states, in certain offices, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I can point out so many issues, but I think when it comes to the Competition Commission, SEBI, RBI, the approach has been very stable to keep the Indian economy, the infrastructure market, the stock market, very, I would say, mobile and unique in its own way. Despite what happened with SVB, you are very well aware of that, the Silicon Valley Bank, how it affected Indian startups. So let's now go to the concluding question. And this was, I was keeping for the political economy of India. Now, we all are aware, I mean, we have discussed in the beginning how political parties stifle certain infrastructure projects, right? I mean, we know that Delhi Metro has its own phase 4, for example, which is still not being done because obviously there's a government of NCT of Delhi which is unable to, do so because obviously there are certain quote unquote approval issues. And yes, there's a political economic game going on. But my question is in a certain way that uh, when we look at this aspect of political consensus and motivation, because I understand politics through that way only as a lawyer, because I am into the not in the litigation side but in the private law side, and I see this way that either it is political consensus to have bad policies or good policies, or either it is political motivation to stifle something or have something good. Because Aadhaar could have been stifled by the NDA government, but yet Nandan Nilekani's efforts were appreciated, and now Aadhaar is something else despite the 2018 Supreme Court judgment. So, I mean, these interventions were never expected. So, is it like a very funny thing to see that major parties across the world, even in India, even in the US, they have this thing that they're copying the 20th century tools of dissent or, protest or whatsoever they call it. It's like, because there's a guy called Alex Kocheli, and he wrote about the Brazilianization of economy. So it's like in Latin America, you have a situation that it is a hyperinflation, therefore, and obviously the costs are not good. Infrastructure economy is not growing up, and therefore people just don't have the mobility to do so, like capacity and all those issues. So is it like that reason from the political economy side that we see such issues like beyond party lines, beyond people, because even we live in a post-ideological world. What is left and right doesn't matter anymore. So it's not the Cold War era. So
just to add another dimension to it before you have your concluding remarks on the issue. Now, on specific strategic issues, we have a cross-party consensus like Pakistan, like hard security issues like China, etc., etc. I mean, people may try to have little rhetoric here and there to score strong points.
That's only if you can tell the difference between People's Republic and Republic of China.
I mean,
Yes,
I
yes, yes.
few and
You remember.
few
That
aberrations
was
here
a
and there.
very,
Generally, there is a
yeah.
on few issues there is a
I'm
consensus.
joking.
There is consensus because it is easy to understand or look at hard security and think, okay, it's a hard security, it's a territorial issues. But now more and more India's economic growth, there is a strategic interest beyond just hard security. The economics comes in, and that is where I think, at least I believe, the political class beyond national parties have not put their mind in. For example, Japanese investments in bullet train is not just an economic investment; it has a larger strategic purpose in furthering India and Japanese relations. And Japan, in Northeast, the only reason why Japanese are the only investors in Northeast is because India trusts Japan more than any other country. So there are
Yeah,
strategic angles. So do you think our political class needs a kind of a deep state understanding of economics
absolutely.
also now, like in economics also
Absolutely.
there needs to be a consensus, and that is what is lacking in this reversal of all this.
Absolutely. I think that they need to do it. The problem is, who do you talk to, right? I mean, this is you need people who are capable of and for many years in India, you had this understanding because all parties had really serious leaders who could actually in a mature way discuss and come to a conclusion. You don't see that anymore across party lines. You may have, I mean, you certainly have. I'm not saying that there are not significant, serious people in each party. It's the question is who is the one who's leading the party that has, and then that really is the problem in terms of reaching this kind of mature agreement on what to talk about and what not to talk about. I mean, if you remember in the 1990s, or even until the 1990s, it was not unusual for Indian delegations going abroad on very crucial issues, votes to the UN that would be made up of all party members, or at least from the leading parties. You don't see that anymore. You haven't seen that in a while. Not just not talking about just this government, but also certainly in the 2000s, that kind of cross-party uh, consensus or cooperation has really been missing. And I think it really is a function of how some of these parties are led.
And do you think it is more difficult on economic matters to have deep consensus because economics touches your political constituents more directly
I
than the
think
hard
so. I
security
think you.
matters?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, Aditya. I mean, this whole thing about OPS, right, old pension scheme. It's a race to the bottom uh, because you think you're going to get elected, but then what's going to happen is the future generations down the line are the ones who are going to carry the bag for you. So this is a real problem. I mean, you've seen this. You see the states. Most of these states, all they have no room to make any investments. It's all paying for current account expenditures because they want to indulge in this kind of competitive populism, which is it pays dividends in the short term, but in the long term you end up in a very bad place.
So maybe I think the way we look at political motivation needs to really change. Perhaps I think so because, I mean, I think we just got some stat and the very deficit that Punjab and even Himachal Pradesh have, it's actually very high. I mean, after what will happen with the one old pension, sorry, OPS. I'm so sorry for the tongue twisting issue. I think we really see some surge, and that's problematic. But I think it's a whole some political class problem that parties just don't wish to agree. Although sometimes we see certain think tanks going with certain members of parliament, like ORF does it when it comes to certain meets with NATO and EU. But otherwise, I think we never see. I mean, we know a particular party leader who definitely goes with a party leader and so forth, and that's a great thing which happens in New Delhi. But I think we need to see more engagement. Maybe I don't know. BJD, DMK, BJP, Congress, all these just go somewhere and do things. I mean, we. I think you may be aware of the IPAC thing, right? Wherein we have an MP from BJD and an Assam Congress MP who actually are a part of that. So that's maybe something to look forward to?
I think I think there's certain fundamental issues around the economy and strategy and all of that, where parties. I mean, I'm not just talking about the Indian case, but I'm talking around the world. I think the world has become much more polarized, and
Yeah.
everywhere in the world, and when you are polarized like that, it becomes much harder to reach consensus on almost any issue. And I think a lot of this is a function of the way politics was run and managed in previous generations, and and how how information has evolved, where people now, uh, it's not really a post-ideological world; it's a post-truth world. People no longer consume
Yeah.
news from the same
Of course.
source, right? So your truth is what information you have access to, and that's in some ways it's good because it promotes greater accountability, but in some ways it's bad because you sometimes, or I mean, certainly on the fringes, people are consuming information that is